Sir, this is a luxury showroom, not a museum for nostalgic mechanics. The words sliced through the pristine air of elite classic motors, drawing smirks from prospective buyers in designer suits. Thomas Miller's weathered hands, calloused from 50 years of breathing life into dying engines, trembled slightly as they rested on the gleaming hood of the 1967 Shelby GT 500. The same hood he had restored decades ago, back when this beauty was just another broken dream in his small garage. Now, under the dealership's crystal chandeliers, its $300,000 price tag mocked his life savings. The showroom buzzed with the artificial energy of Los Angeles's elite, their whispers and stifled laughter echoing off spotless glass walls. Women in four-figure dresses pretended to study the vintage collection while stealing glances at the old man in oil-stained jeans. The sales manager, Blake Thompson, adjusted his Italian silk tie, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured toward the exit. Security stood ready, their earpieces gleaming, waiting for the signal to escort the unwanted visitor out. In the corner, partially hidden behind a pristine Aston Martin, a figure in a black motorcycle jacket watched the scene unfold. His presence went unnoticed, but his eyes never left the old mechanic's face, studying the mixture of love and loss reflected in every line. The man's fingers traced the car's curves with the gentle reverence of a father touching his child's face, each movement telling a story that no price tag could capture. A story that was about to change everything in this temple of wealth. Thomas Miller had first met this Shelby GT 500 in the summer of '69, when it was nothing more than a broken dream collecting dust in a widow's garage. The woman couldn't afford to fix it, her husband's pride and joy, now silent after his passing. Back then, Thomas had worked 14-hour days at his small repair shop, but he'd stayed up countless nights restoring that car for free, knowing what it meant to her. Every bolt, every panel, every piece of chrome trim had passed through his hands, each repair a prayer for the man he'd never met. The car had roared back to life under his care, and the widow's tears of joy had been all the payment he'd ever needed. For 15 years he'd maintained it for her, watching her son grow up learning to drive in his father's cherished vehicle. Now, 3 decades later, here it stood under crystal chandeliers, wearing a price tag that could buy a small house. The same engine he had rebuilt, purring with a sound he'd know anywhere. The distinctive rhythm he'd fine-tuned himself, a mechanical heartbeat he'd never forgotten. Blake Thompson's voice cut through his memories like a knife through warm butter. Mr. Miller, I believe I've made myself clear. This vehicle is reserved for serious buyers only. His polished Italian loafers clicked against the showroom's marble floor as he took another step forward, hand outstretched toward the exit. Actually, Thomas straightened his back, years of dignity rising to meet the moment. I'm here about purchasing the car. The words hung in the air like exhaust on a cold morning, drawing barely concealed snickers from a group of young executives examining a nearby Ferrari. Blake Thompson's carefully manicured eyebrows arched in manufactured surprise, his lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. Sir? Thompson's voice dripped with rehearsed patience, each word measured and sharp. This particular vehicle is priced at $300,000. Perhaps I could interest you in some photographs from our gift shop? More laughter rippled through the showroom, less restrained now. A woman in a Chanel suit whispered something to her companion, both of them glancing at Thomas's worn work boots and faded jeans. Thomas's weathered hand slipped into his jacket pocket, pulling out a carefully folded check. The paper was crisp and new, but his fingers that held it were stained with decades of honest work. I've been saving for this moment for 40 years, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of countless overtime shifts and deferred dreams. Every extra job, every weekend worked. This car, she's more than just metal and paint to me. Thompson barely glanced at the check, his attention caught by a wealthy couple who had just entered the showroom. "Security," he said smoothly, gesturing with two manicured fingers. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's disturbing our other customers." Two security guards moved forward, their black suits absorbing the showroom's gleaming light. Thomas's hands trembled as he carefully refolded his check, each crease deliberate, as if he were trying to fold away 40 years of dreams along with it. The Shelby's engine ticked softly as it cooled, a sound he'd once known as well as his own heartbeat. "I restored this car." His voice cracked slightly, drawing more sophisticated chuckles from the growing audience. "Every inch, every part. I can tell you exactly what's been replaced, what's original, down to the smallest screw." He touched the hood one last time, fingers lingering on the warm metal. That tiny dent on the underside of the left fender, still there from '72, the slight irregularity in the idle, that's because the carburetor's been adjusted to compensate for the original manifold. "Fascinating story," Thompson's voice dripped sarcasm as he checked his Rolex. "But this isn't some nostalgic support group. This is a place of business." He turned to the security guards. "Gentlemen?" In the corner, the figure in the motorcycle jacket suddenly straightened, helmet tucked under his arm. As the guards reached for Thomas's shoulders, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Tell me more about that carburetor adjustment." Rising Action, Part 1, The Tide Turns. The security guards hesitated, their hands frozen mid-reach as the figure emerged from behind the Aston Martin. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd like a wave, whispers and hastily raised phones tracking his movement. Keanu Reeves walked with the same quiet purpose he brought to every role. But this wasn't acting. His eyes held genuine interest as he approached the Shelby GT 500. Thomas straightened, years of mechanical expertise overriding his emotional turmoil. "The original manifold has a slight warping on the third port," he explained, his voice gaining strength. "Most restorers would just replace it, but that'd be wrong. This car's got history in every imperfection. So I adjusted the carburetor to compensate, tweaked the fuel mixture just right. Takes a delicate touch, but when you get it perfect..." He gestured to the engine's quiet purr. Keanu nodded, running his hand along the car's bodywork with genuine appreciation. "You can hear it," he said softly. "That subtle rhythm in the idle. It's got character." He turned to Thompson, whose face had transformed from dismissive to desperate recognition. "How long have you worked with classic cars?" Well, I oversee all sales operations for Elite Classic Motors," Thompson stumbled, his practiced smoothness cracking. "Our team of experts—" "That's not what I asked," Keanu interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "This man just told us about a specific carburetor adjustment for a warped manifold port. Could you explain why that's significant?" The showroom fell silent except for the Shelby's patient idle, as if the car itself was waiting for an answer. Rising Action. Part 2. Knowledge and Worth. Thompson's mouth opened and closed, his expensive education offering no answers about carburetors and manifolds. The silence stretched uncomfortably as phones continued recording, capturing his floundering moment for social media eternity. The young executives who had been laughing earlier suddenly found the floor fascinating, their own expensive shoes now as uncomfortable as Thompson's silence. I focus on the business side," Thompson finally managed, his voice having lost its earlier authority. "Our technical team handles those details." He reached for his phone, presumably to call for backup, but Keanu's next words stopped him cold. "You're selling pieces of history," Keanu said, turning back to the Shelby. "Every car here has a story, but you're treating them like fancy watches in a display case." He gestured to Thomas. "This man isn't just telling you about mechanical specs. He's telling you about dedication, about preserving something's soul instead of just its shine." The crowd's attention shifted, phones now capturing every word from the Hollywood star who seemed more interested in an old mechanic's story than the millionaire's playground around him. Thomas stood straighter, dignity returning to his weathered frame as Keanu asked him about other restorations he'd done. The widow, the original owner's wife, she used to bring me cookies every Friday while I worked on it, Thomas recalled, his voice warm with memory. Said the sound of me fixing her husband's car made her feel like he wasn't really gone. That's the kind of thing you can't put a price tag on. Keanu's eyes met Thompson's. So tell me again, why isn't this gentleman qualified to buy this car? Thompson's composure cracked completely as he glanced between Keanu, the growing crowd of recording phones, and his suddenly uncertain security guards. Mr. Reeves! He attempted to regain control, forcing a practiced smile. While we appreciate this gentleman's historical connection to the vehicle, our clientele expects a certain standard. The provenance of our automobiles... Provenance? Keanu's quiet laugh held no mockery, only a kind of wonder. You're standing next to the man who literally gave this car its provenance. Every hour of restoration, every careful decision to preserve rather than replace, every solution found through skill instead of just throwing money at it. That's what makes these cars more than just expensive toys. The whispers in the showroom had shifted from mockery to murmurs of agreement. A younger woman in designer clothes lowered her phone and stepped forward. My grandfather was a mechanic, she said, her voice carrying across the showroom. He used to tell me stories just like this. Thomas pulled out his folded check again, hands steady now. I'm not here to disrupt your business, he said quietly. I'm here because some things matter more than money. This car, it's not just about the metal and chrome. It's about the widow's cookies and her son learning to drive and all those nights I spent getting everything just right. And yes, he added, looking Thompson directly in the eye, it's about having worked hard enough to finally afford bringing her home. The silence that followed was broken only by the Shelby's gentle idle, that distinctive rhythm that Thomas had perfected all those years ago, still keeping time like a faithful heartbeat. Keanu placed his motorcycle helmet on the Shelby's hood, a deliberate gesture that made Thompson wince, and leaned against the car with casual familiarity. You know what I love about classic cars? He asked, addressing the room but watching Thompson. They're time machines. Each one carries stories, holds memories, but they're not museum pieces. They need people who understand them, who can keep their stories alive. He turned to Thomas. What would you do with this car if you bought it? Drive it, Thomas answered without hesitation, a smile lighting his weathered face. Every Sunday, weather permitting. Take it to local shows. Let kids sit behind the wheel. Let them see that these machines have souls. His hand rested on the fender, an unconscious gesture of affection. The widow's son. He's got kids of his own now. Promised I'd take them for a ride, let them feel what their grandfather's car was like. A distinguished-looking man in the crowd stepped forward, his Swiss watch and bespoke suit marking him as one of the dealership's target customers. I was going to make an offer on this car, he said, looking at Thompson. As an investment. Keep it in climate-controlled storage. Wait for the value to appreciate. He shook his head slowly. But that would be a waste, wouldn't it? These cars were meant to be driven, meant to keep their stories alive. Thompson's face had gone pale as he watched one of his prime customers side with the mechanic. The security guards had backed away, their earpieces silent, seemingly unsure which side of history they wanted to be on. Mr. Thompson, Keanu's voice remained gentle but carried an edge of steel. I've been fortunate enough to make good money in my career. Could walk out of here with any car I wanted. He gestured around the showroom. But money can't buy the kind of connection this man has with this car. Can't buy the hours he spent learning every inch of it, the relationships he built, the history he preserved. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the dealership. Phones kept recording, but the atmosphere had shifted from mockery to something approaching reverence. A teenager in the back called out, "My TikTok's blowing up already. Everyone's saying the mechanic should get the car." Thomas unfolded his check one final time, smoothing it carefully before holding it out. The amount was clearly visible. His entire life's savings, meant for this moment. "I don't have fancy cars or designer clothes," he said quietly. "Spent my life fixing things others thought were beyond repair. But I do have enough to buy this car, Mr. Thompson. And I promise you, she'll be cared for better than anyone else could." Thompson looked desperately around the showroom, but found no allies. The wealthy customers who usually hung on his every word were now standing with Thomas, their own phones raised. Even his security team had drifted back, unwilling to be on the wrong side of what was clearly becoming a viral moment. "Perhaps," Thompson managed, his voice strained, "we should discuss this in my office." But Keanu wasn't finished. "Actually," Keanu said, picking up his helmet, "let's keep this here, in front of everyone." He turned to address the crowd directly. "You know what I see in this showroom? A bunch of price tags trying to define something priceless. Every car here has a story, but this one?" He patted the Shelby's hood. "This one has a guardian. Someone who understands that real value isn't about what something costs. It's about what it means." The distinguished customer who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. "Mr. Thompson, I was prepared to offer significantly above asking price for this vehicle, but I'm withdrawing my offer." He turned to Thomas with genuine respect. "This car belongs with someone who loves it, who understands it, who'll keep its story alive." Thomas stood straighter, years of dignity flowing back into his stance. More voices joined in, the crowd now firmly on his side. The young woman who had mentioned her grandfather wiped tears from her eyes as she recorded. Even some of Thompson's other salespeople were nodding, perhaps remembering why they'd fallen in love with classic cars in the first place. Thompson looked at the check in Thomas's outstretched hand, then at the phones recording his every move, and finally at Keanu's steady gaze. The carefully maintained veneer of superiority cracked, replaced by something approaching understanding. He reached for the check with a slightly trembling hand. "The paperwork," he said quietly, "will take about an hour to prepare." He paused, then added something that clearly cost him more than money. "Perhaps you could tell me more about that carburetor adjustment while we wait." An hour later, Thomas sat behind the wheel of the Shelby, his calloused hands resting on the same steering wheel he had carefully restored decades ago. The new keys, his keys now, lay in his palm like a dream made metal. The showroom crowd had thinned, but those who remained watched with genuine smiles as he adjusted the mirrors with familiar precision. Keanu leaned in through the driver's window, his usual reserve replaced by evident satisfaction. "You know," he said quietly, "I've got a few old bikes I've been meaning to get restored. Could use someone who understands that machines have souls." He slipped a business card onto the dashboard. "Someone who knows the difference between fixing something and bringing it back to life." Thompson stood awkwardly nearby, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. He'd spent the last hour listening to Thomas explain the intricacies of classic car restoration, asking questions with growing, genuine interest. Now he watched as Thomas turned the key, and the engine responded with that distinctive purr, the sound of a machine reuniting with the man who knew its heart. The videos hit social media like a tidal wave. Return of the Shelby and Kindness Keanu trended worldwide, but it was the comments that told the real story. People shared their own tales of family mechanics, of cars that carried generations of memories, of machines that were more than just status symbols. The Elite Classic Motors showroom found itself flooded with calls, not just from buyers but from restoration experts offering to share their knowledge. Thompson, perhaps surprised by his own transformation, had already scheduled a series of weekend workshops where experienced mechanics could share their expertise with potential buyers. Thomas had agreed to lead the first one, bringing decades of hands-on wisdom to a new generation of enthusiasts. The distinguished customer who had withdrawn his offer now sat on the workshop's planning committee, talking about creating a mentorship program for young mechanics. The Shelby, meanwhile, had already given its promised ride to the widow's grandchildren. Their laughter as they sat in their grandfather's car echoed across years and generations, carried on the sound of that perfectly tuned engine that Thomas had brought back to life so many years ago. 1 month later, on a sunny Sunday morning, a small crowd gathered at Thomas's neighborhood cars and coffee meet. The Shelby sat proudly among other classics, its chrome catching the early light. But unlike the other vehicles roped off for display, this one had children sitting in the driver's seat, their parents watching as Thomas explained how each gauge and dial told the car's story. Keanu stopped by, arriving quietly on his motorcycle. He found Thomas teaching Thompson, now a regular at these Sunday meetings, how to detect an engine's health just by listening. The actor smiled, remembering that day in the showroom, as he watched the former sales manager nod intently, his expensive suit replaced by practical workwear, a notepad filled with carefully written observations. The widow's great-grandchild, barely 5 years old, ran her small hands along the Shelby's fender, the same way her grandfather once had. "This car," Thomas told her, his voice soft with understanding, "is worth more than all the money in the world. Know why?" The child looked up curiously. "Because it carries love in every part, and that's something you can't put a price tag on."